what happened over the weekend in the world with the Sabbath, that we would get 3 different questions from 3 different people in different parts of the country. And I don't really know, but what I do know is that based on these questions, the Sabbath really is not well understood. And so I thought we'd look into it tonight for a couple reasons. One, obviously, is there's a value in simply knowing the truth. Another is that it's amazing. There's a kind of a movement in Christendom that, that we ought to be keeping the Sabbath. God gave the Sabbath for people, and we ought to be keeping the Sabbath. And that causes some pretty serious division and also some guilt, because then people sit around and they go, wow, should I really be keeping the Sabbath? I mean, and then there's some confusion, and probably with some good reason, because it's not, there are simple verses in the scripture, but they kind of get trampled on by the various pieces of logic. So let's go take a quick look at one of the simple verses. Let's go to Colossians chapter 2. And Colossians 2 obviously is in the epistles of Paul, so it is very much written to the church of grace, the administration of grace. And I think that Colossians 2 has the clearest statement to us about the Sabbath, and also just how the Sabbath relates. And so as far as what the way you and I are supposed to live, verse 16 of Colossians 2, therefore, let no one judge you with respect to food or drink, or food and drink, or with respect to a feast day, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. And these were things in the law. Obviously, judge you with respect to food and drink. What you ate and what you drank was regulated by the Mosaic Law. Or with respect to a feast day, and that would be not only just Passover, Pentecost, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Tabernacles, the Day of Trumpets, but by the time that Paul was writing Colossians, the Sadducees, Pharisees, religious leaders had added a bunch of minor feasts and come up with all these various regulations. Or a new moon, every new moon was the start of a new month, and at the start of a new month, God had the sacrifices and offerings at the temple doubled. And you can go back into the law of Moses and see that. And so the new moon became a festival, a feast day, if you will. And then, of course, a Sabbath day. And so basically what the scripture is saying here is, look, don't let people judge you. And then it goes on and it says, verse 17, these are a shadow of the things to come, but the reality is Christ. We've got to understand what that's saying. If you can picture like a tree on a sunny day in a field, and the tree casts a shadow. The shadow is very real. It's there, but it's not the tree. And that's exactly what this is saying when it says these things are a shadow of the things to come. So in other words, what you ate, what you drank, the feast days, the new moon celebrations, the Sabbath day, they all pictured various things that were to come in the future. And by the way, one of the things that the Sabbath day pictured, if you've ever heard the day-age theory, there are, it goes like this, there's going to be about 7,000 years of creation. And the first 4,000 were, of course, the Old Testament. Then since the time of Christ, there have been 2 more thousand. And so basically what you've got then is somewhere around this time, who knows, it could be very quickly, it could be 50 more years, 100 more years, we don't really know. And then there's going to be 1,000-year millennial kingdom. So the rest on the 7th day was a prophecy of the rest in the 7,000th millennium. Now that's not stated strictly in scripture. It's kind of pasted together, but I think it's got some validity. So basically, you had these eating and drinking and various festival and new moon laws and Sabbath laws, and they were a shadow of what was to come. So they all portrayed the future in some way. But then it says, but the reality, and if I remember correctly, there's a translation out there. I think it even did this in the REV for a while, but it made it a little bit clumsy. But the reality that casts the shadow is Christ. So you have Jesus Christ, and he's the future reality that is the reason for the shadow. Why do you have the shadow there to begin with? You have it there because of Jesus Christ. So the Sabbath was a shadow that pointed to Christ. And if we go go up a couple verses, we're in 16 and 17. If we simply go up verse 13, and you, when you were dead due to your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made alive together with him, and that's our unity in Christ, our union with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having wiped clean the certificate of indebtedness that was against us, which was hostile to us by means of the regulations. And that's interesting. Verse 14, it was hostile to us. How? By means of the regulations. In other words, it set forth regulations that people just couldn't keep. And that's why Romans and Galatians say, no man is justified by the law. No flesh can be justified by the law. Why? Because nobody could pull it off. And the law wasn't given, according to Romans, the law wasn't given to justify people. The law was given to show people that they needed God's grace and mercy. What does it say in Romans 2? The law was given that every mouth might be stopped. Everybody shut up about how good they're doing and just fall on their knees and say, God, I really need some help here. I can't pull this off. And that's exactly what the deal was. And so here, the certificate of indebtedness. Why the indebtedness? Because we kept breaking the law. And sin, if you remember, I did an earlier teaching in which sin was considered a debt. And so is people sin against God, you build up a debt. And so there's a certificate of indebtedness, and it was hostile to us. Why? By means of all these rules and regulations. And he took it away and nailed it to the cross. And then, of course, it goes on and then says, look, those things, anyway, they were a shadow of what was to come. And we can get another look in Romans chapter 14. If we go to the book of Romans, chapter 14, and verses 1 to 5, or I'm sorry, not 1 to 5, starting in verse 5. Verse 5 of Romans 14, one person judges one day to be above another day. In other words, more important, more valuable, whatever, while another judges every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. So basically, it isn't the thing that we've got to pay attention here is if one day was more valuable than another day, God would say so. But he doesn't say so. He says, you want a day to be important? Fine. Just get convinced in your own mind and live your life that way. But don't go projecting that onto anybody else. In verse 6, he says, the one who observes the day, observes it for the Lord. That's between you and the Lord. The one who eats, whatever you're eating or not eating, eats for the Lord. And he gives thanks to God. And the one who does not eat is for the Lord. He doesn't eat and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives for himself, none dies for himself. For if we live for the Lord, or if we die for the Lord. So then whether we live or die, we're the Lord's. And then basically it goes on. But the point is that here again, like in Colossians, it tells us there is, that we make up our mind about what day is important. And like Colossians said, don't let anybody judge you when it comes to keeping or not keeping a Sabbath. Now, that being said, let me say that that making sure that you get plenty of rest is highly underrated in the United States. The devil is incredibly invested in making sure that the vast majority of humanity is foggy-minded. And a great way, if you've ever been overtired, then you know how foggy-minded you can be. And every study I read says that for mental health, for physical health, for losing weight, for every kind of possible health benefit that you want, you need at least 7 hours of sleep a night, and hopefully 7.5 or even 8. And the body rejuvenates itself. It's just like it says in the scripture, his mercies are new every morning. And so if we get a good night's sleep, every morning it's like, you get a good start over. So when the Bible talks about Sabbath, I'm not a proponent by any stretch of the imagination that Christians should take a Sabbath, but I am a proponent of the fact that Christians need to take naps or get 7 to 8 hours sleep, or make sure they have rest, a time when you can just let your mind relax. The devil knows about that too, and as long as you're listening to music or kind of watching TV in the background or whatever, your mind is always going. And I don't need to tell you that the incidence of mental illness, mental breakdowns, foggy thinking, that type of thing, the amount of people on psychotropic drugs today is phenomenal. It's amazing. You can't imagine. I've heard some studies that between psychotropic drugs and sleeping pills, or pills that keep you from being overly nervous, it's like 1 person out of 3 in the country. And our brains need to rest, where you can just sit with whatever it is that you drink or eat, cup of coffee I like, and you just sit in the quiet and let your mind kind of unpack and bring up whatever's coming up. And that's so healthy. In the world, people, they wake up to a music alarm, and then they listen to music while they're getting dressed, and then they listen to the news while they're cooking, and then they get in their car and they turn on the radio, and you never give yourself a break. And the human body needs a break. God mandated it through the Sabbath, but now we don't have to do a Sabbath, but we don't want to be unwise and not rest. Now let's go back to the historic origin of the Sabbath, and let's go to Genesis chapter 2. And what I want to point out in Genesis chapter 2 is that God rested on the 7th day, as you know. But as far as we can tell, he didn't make a big deal about it. There is no record of anyone from the fall of Adam and Eve all the way until after the Exodus from Egypt of anybody having a Sabbath. And this is something that people that say that you and I ought to keep the Sabbath ignore. So let's go back. Let's take a look at Genesis chapter 2. And it says, "And the heavens and earth were finished, even all their army." And it's a funny translation, but the Hebrew word really is army. It gets translated host. But a host is not a guy in a suit and tie with a towel over his arm in a restaurant. A host biblically was an army, so we just translated it army. And I think that's very interesting because it parallels the order and purpose of an army with the order and purpose of God's creation, that God created the universe with an order to it, an inherent order, and a purpose and a direction, and of course, even leaders. So the heavens and earth were finished, even all their army. Verse 2, "On the 7th day, God finished his work that he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had made. And he blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all his work that he had created and made." And so we typically think of this as, well, this is Genesis chapter 2, And so when God says on the seventh day he finished his work and he rested on the seventh day from all his work, that, well, that's kind of then going to be the pattern for everybody. But it wasn't. In fact, when was Genesis written? Well, it was written by Moses, ostensibly in the first year or couple years of the Exodus. So Genesis was actually written about 1450 BC. Did God tell anybody before that time that he rested on the seventh day? He may have, but the fact of the matter is there's not one stitch of evidence that God told a soul that he rested on the seventh day. He did, but he didn't do anything with it. He certainly didn't command anybody to rest on the seventh day. And if you take the 4,000 years of the Old Testament and you run them through, the Exodus is 1450 BC, which means that basically for over 2,500 years of the Old Testament, there wasn't a single person that had a mandated day of rest. And there were plenty of times and plenty of people that God could have told that to. For example, we know, with Cain and Abel, I mean, the fall had barely happened. You have Cain and Abel, and God gives them commands concerning sacrifices, both what and when. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, we know about sacrifices, what and when. Well, how about the Sabbath? Not a word about the Sabbath. So you go forward to Noah, and here's Noah in the ark, and Noah gets off the ark, and God changes rules, and he says, where before you couldn't eat meat, now you can eat meat. And he said, by the way, if there's going to be criminals, if man sheds the blood of man, then you guys have to step up to the plate and administer justice. And God gave a series of rules and made a covenant with Noah. Did he mention a word about the Sabbath? Not a word. Then you go forward a couple hundred years and you got Abraham, and God tells Abraham a boatload. I mean, Abraham was called the friend of God. Did God ever say a word to Abraham about take a rest day? Make sure, Abraham, you've got all these flocks and herds and all these people that you're over, and you ought to give them a break. You ought to give them a rest. Did God say a word about the Sabbath? No, he didn't. And so God waited until there was the nation of Israel. It was after the Exodus, about 1450 BC, that God says the first thing about the Sabbath. So let's go to Exodus chapter 16. And the wording of this, it's very interesting. As I was doing the background work for this teaching, one of the things I hate to say it surprised me, because it sort of didn't, was the people translators that haven't studied this subject well. It's like they didn't really see the depth of what was going on. And I think what's happened is so many people got stuck because God rested on the seventh day of creation. So, of course, the Sabbath has existed since Genesis. No, it hasn't. God rested on the seventh day, but he didn't command anybody else to rest until we get all the way until after the Exodus. And so we've got to make sure that that's straight. So basically, they're wandering around. They've now been, if we look at Exodus chapter 16, verse 1, they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin that's between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. Now, this is important for two reasons. First of all, we know that if you remember, as they were slaves in Egypt, they sacrificed the Passover, and the Passover is always killed on what day of the month?
14th.
Yeah, I can read some lists. The 14th. Yeah, exactly, the 14th. So they killed the lamb on the 14th of the month, and then that night, because they then took the blood, well, they killed him on the 14th, which is the afternoon, And then they took the blood and put it on their doorposts. And then that night, which was the 15th, because the new day starts at sundown. So on the 15th of the month at midnight, the angel of death killed all the firstborn in Egypt that weren't protected by the blood. And then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, get your people and get out of here, clean out. We don't want you, And so the Israelites, who were more or less expecting this, packed up their stuff, and they were slaves anyway, so they didn't own much. They just packed up their stuff and they left Egypt. And so that was on the 15th day of the month. And of course, they're leaving in the dark, except remember that Israel has a lunar month. So the 15th of the month in the Bible is always a full moon. So they were leaving on the 15th of the month, lunar month. So the first day of the month, it's always dark, no moon. Then from the 1st to the 15th, you have the waxing moon, the moon growing in strength. And then the 15th of the month is always a full moon. And then starting with the 16th, you have the waning moon until you get down to the end where and technically it's 29 and a quarter days is a lunar month. So some days the month would be 29 days, some days it would be 30 days. But somewhere in there, either the 29th or 30th day, you'd be back to the new moon, and then there'd be no moon, and of course it'd be dark again. So when the Israelites left Egypt, there was a full moon. That's why they were able to leave so efficaciously at night. And then here, they're journeying, and it's now the 15th day of the second month, so they could walk at night if they wanted to, but basically it says they came to the wilderness of Sin on the 15th day. So they've now been traveling for exactly a month. They've been out for 30 days. Verse 2, and the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, what's new? So they murmur, and so God's going to give them manna. So let's see, first he gave them quail, but then verse 13, and let's see, okay, good. So verse 13, and it came to pass at evening that the quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, behold, on the surface of the wilderness was a small round thing, small as the frost on the ground. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. That's really nice. If you don't know what something is, you say, what is it? What is it is what manna is. The Hebrew for manna is actually man-hu. What is that? So that's how manna got its name. What are you eating? I'm eating, what is that? So that's basically, what is that? They didn't know what it was. Moses said, it's the bread that Yahweh has given you to eat. This is the thing Yahweh has commanded. Gather of it every one according to his eating, and omer a head according to the number of your persons you may take it, every man for those who were in his tent. And they did so. And then verse 19, Moses said, don't leave any of it till morning. Verse 20, so they did, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was angry. And then verse 21, they gathered it morning by morning, as much as he needed to eat, and when the sun grew hot, it melted. And I really like that when the sun grew hot, it melted, because it demonstrates a principle. If you remember, God put Adam and Eve in the garden to guard it and cultivate it. And they had to work, and they had to be diligent to do that. God created people to work. He didn't create us to be just lazy people and sit around while he takes care of us. And this is a great example of that, because the manna was free. But I tell you what, if you've ever been to the Sinai, and I have, it gets hot really early. So if you wanted to eat, you got your butt up out of bed and you went out and gathered, or else the sun would come up, it would get hot. And you'd go out and be like, well, sorry, kids, I didn't get up early enough today. And I love the fact that God says, look, I'll give you the food, but there's inherently, you're going to have to work if you're going to get this. Verse 22, it came to pass on the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Verse 23, he said to them, this is what Yahweh has spoken. And then he says, tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you want to bake, boil what you want to boil, and all that remains over set aside for yourselves to be kept until morning. So basically what's going on here is God is here introducing the Sabbath to Israel. If the Israelites had been keeping the Sabbath, then they would have understood the Sabbath and how it works. And so Moses wouldn't have had to say tomorrow was a day of rest, a holy Sabbath, and the word Sabbath is just simply also means a cessation, a stopping, an end to work, if you will. So if the children of Israel had been keeping the Sabbath, Moses would have just looked at him and said, what are you guys talking about? Tomorrow's the Sabbath. Come on. We've been keeping the Sabbath for generations. Why does he have to introduce to them, hey, let me tell you how this works. Tomorrow is a day of rest. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh. And the reason he has to do that is because this is its introduction to Israel. They had never done this before. And so he explains it. He says, today you cook what you want to cook, and you set things aside to be kept until the morning. They set it aside in the morning until the morning, as Moses ordered. It didn't stink, nor were there any worms in it. Verse 25, Moses said, eat that today, for tomorrow is a Sabbath, not the Sabbath at this time, to Yahweh. Tomorrow you will not find it in the field. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, a Sabbath, on it there will be none. Yet it came to pass on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather. Now, why would they do that? Because they had never experienced a Sabbath before. Had they been practicing a Sabbath, and had they been, following regulations of a Sabbath, they wouldn't have gotten up on the Sabbath day and gone around looking for manna, because they would have known, wow, I'm breaking the Sabbath. But here's that's just Moses. He says tomorrow's a day of rest. There's not going to be any manna. Oh yeah, they just blew him off. Why? It was a very first time, and I thought it's very interesting here that verse 27, they went out to gather. In verse 28, Yahweh said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? I told you I wasn't going to be there. You guys aren't listening. This is totally different than later on in the book of Numbers, when the man is gathering sticks on the Sabbath and God says to execute him. And so they execute this guy for gathering sticks on the Sabbath. This was the very first time that the Sabbath was instituted or inculcated, if you will, among mankind. And so they didn't know what to do with it, and God had to explain it to them. And then God goes on to explain it. Now this verse here, verse 23, tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. This is I'm going to go to my Bible Works here and take a look at some versions, because a lack of understanding of what we're dealing with here has caused translations that become very confusing. For example, the New American Standard reads this way. Then Moses said to them, this is what Yahweh meant, or the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Now, when you translate it that way and you take two different Hebrew words, the Hebrew word for rest and the Hebrew word for Sabbath, and you translate them both Sabbath in one verse, given the fact that the average person hasn't really put together the subject to begin with, then they think, obviously from this translation, that the Jews already knew exactly what the Sabbath was. because God says tomorrow is a Sabbath. Oh, okay, yeah, duh, we forgot. Oh, it's like, come on, guys. This is the introduction of the Sabbath, and it's not the Hebrew word for Sabbath, it's the Hebrew word for rest. Now, the Hebrew word for rest and the Hebrew word for Sabbath come from the same trilateral root in Hebrew, but they're still different words. And I like the NET translation is very good, I thought. NET said, Moses said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a time of cessation from work, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. And that's a great way of saying it. Tomorrow is a day when we're going to cease working. And we're going to start, it's a Sabbath. And then he explains what it is. He introduces it's a cessation of work, and he explains what it is. It's a Sabbath. And so this then is the 15th day of the second month. Now, if we go over to chapter 19. Now, in chapter 19, it says, in the third month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt on the same day. And then people argue about whether the same day is the first day of the month or the 15th of the month or what day of the month it is. I'm going to put my money on it's the 15th of the month, but can I prove it? I really can't. It's just the same day that they had gone out of the land of Egypt was the 15th of the month. So if this is the third month, the 15th day of the month, then basically what that tells you is that the Israelites at this point had been eating manna for a month, and they would have observed 4 Sabbath days. So, it's not like they really completely understand the Sabbath, but they're getting there. And so, God says, instructs them about coming before the mountain and this and that, the other thing. Chapter 20, when they gather up Israel at the base of the mountain, then God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh, your God. And I think you guys, this audience well knows that the 10 Commandments were not first given on stone. The 10 Commandments were first shouted down from the mountain to the people. Then it was later that they were written on stone. And that's why it says, verse 1, God spoke all these words. And so he goes through talking, and you get to verse 8, and he's now in the 4th commandment. And so he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work. And again, why is God explaining this here? This is the law of Moses, and God is explaining the Sabbath. Why is he explaining the Sabbath? Because they had never kept it before. So now he's being very clear about it. If the people of Israel and the people of God had been keeping the Sabbath since Noah or since Abraham, God would have only had to say, hey, this is the Sabbath, keep it holy. But instead, it's only been a month, maybe 4 weeks that they've even been doing this. So here comes the 10 Commandments. And he starts out by saying, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why would God have to tell them to remember the Sabbath day? Well, a couple reasons. One, people, if you're like me and my wife, you get busy, you forget what day it is, work becomes really important. This is what I'm doing, this is what I'm trying to accomplish, all that becomes very important. And the next thing you know, your days of rest get completely trampled into the dust, and you don't take the rest that you need. Another thing is, of course, it's astounding to me how often I have to look at my watch to know what day it is. My watch, I wear the kind of watch that I have the month, the day, the time, and it's astounding how many times I'm going, and I look at my watch, oh yeah. But they didn't have really cool wristwatches. They didn't even have paper calendars. So they had to stay on top of what day was the Sabbath. They couldn't just get all involved in planting or harvesting or taking care of animals or, whatever they were doing, that they just, oh gosh, was yesterday a Sabbath? Wow, I missed it, sorry. So God has to tell them, look, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And then he explains it. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work, But the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you must not do any work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your livestock, nor your stranger who is inside your gates. And why is God this specific? For the same reason that, like when Christ is with the apostles in Acts 1, and he says, you are to be my witnesses to all the world. And so they say, great. And they go out and they witness to the Jews all over the world, but they forget all about the Gentiles. Because you tend to hear what God is saying in terms of your own understanding. So if God were to simply say, look, guys, tomorrow's a rest day, on it, you must not do any work. They go, oh yeah, I won't. And they'd sit around and say, go do this, go do that, make that happen, start that fire. And they boss their slaves and servants and everybody else around. So God's saying, look, you must not do any work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, your female servant, don't make your animals work. And if anybody's visiting you, they can't work either. So God makes it very plain. Now, what he doesn't do is define work. And he leaves that up. He leaves that fairly loose for people. I mean, there's certain things that we would know, okay, that's really work. But of course, by the time you get to the time of Christ, the religious leaders had made this absolute, instead of the Sabbath being a blessing, the Sabbath was a burden. There were so many regulations and it was so constricting to life. And then verse 11, God says, and this is interesting because then he's saying, look, I'm giving you the Sabbath. I didn't just pull it out of my hat. It's been around for a while in my head. He says, for in 6 days, Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So he doesn't say everybody's been keeping the Sabbath, but he just says, I want to tell you the basis for resting on the seventh day in the law. And then, of course, we know that God set up, as we go through Leviticus, you find out that there's special offerings done on the Sabbath and this kind of thing. Now, I want to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, because in fact, let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 1, because in Deuteronomy 5, God is going to basically repeat the Ten Commandments and make sure that people are crisp on them. And he does it right at the end of the 40 years of the wilderness wanderings. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 3, it came to pass in the 40th year. So they had 40 years of wilderness wanderings. It came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month. So they've done 40 years and 11 months. They've only got one more month to go. The 40 years is over. Moses has passed away. Joshua takes the children of Israel into the promised land. So the entire book of Deuteronomy is written within a 30-day period at the very, very end, the very last month of the whole 40 years of the wilderness wanderings. So he says, it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had commanded him to say to them. So Moses is going to start talking to the children of Israel. We now go to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, we start repeating the Ten Commandments, verse 6, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must not have any gods beside me. And then he goes on, and verse 12, now he's going to say it a little differently. Instead of saying, remember the Sabbath day, he's going to say, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as Yahweh your God commanded you. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God, in which you must not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your livestock, nor your stranger who is inside your gates, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. Now he adds that in Deuteronomy. And it's interesting when we talk about the Sabbath and the origin of the Sabbath, the actual origin of the Sabbath is lost in history, as far as, just exactly some of the other cultures kept a day of rest and that kind of thing. And so the Jewish Sabbath, we know, it started here. It started with God, and it was very humanitarian in its effect. It was given so that people could rest, and even your servants and your male servants and your female servants would be able to rest too. And then verse 15 is really key here. You are to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and Yahweh your God brought you out of there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Now, this is rock solid evidence that the Sabbath was not kept until after the Exodus. So first of all, God says, let's talk about the purpose. Yes, the purpose for the Sabbath was so Israel would have rest and so that life would be a blessing and not just constant working. But then he says, you are to remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. In other words, if you keep that in mind, you'll understand how important it is that you rest and you allow everybody else to rest. Your family gets to rest, your servants get to rest, your visiting friends get to rest, your animals, everything gets to rest. And if you'll remember how hard life was in Egypt, then you'll really appreciate what it means to have a day of rest. And he ends this sentence by saying, I brought you out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand. Therefore, because of that, Yahweh your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So God commanded the Sabbath day because of the harsh bondage in Egypt. And nobody got rest, and it was so difficult for everybody. And God says, I want you to remember that, and that's why I'm giving you the Sabbath day, and you're going to have it for you and your family and your servants and your livestock and even your visitors. And so this was for God. And then this was going to be a time, because Israel was going to be a nation that was based on law. And this was really huge, because in the pagan world, and right through the Roman Empire, and then what's called the divine right of kings. And have you guys heard of the saying the divine right of kings? It's pretty common. You haven't heard of the divine right of kings?
No.
Okay, well, some of you have. Well, if you study the history on the divine right of kings, it came through English law, and it was the idea that the king was the representative of God on earth and could do anything he wanted, because what he did would somehow or other be the will of God. And so what made the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, to be so great was one of the things it did was it limited the rights of kings. And it said that the king was responsible to obey the law. And one of the tenets of the Magna Carta was that the king simply couldn't torture someone and put them to death because he wanted to. That he actually had to have a reason to torture people and put them to death. The fact that was brought up as a plank in the Magna Carta so enraged the king and the Pope, because the Pope was in support of the king, and the king being able to do whatever he wanted because they were in collusion, that the Pope actually excommunicated all of the authors of the Magna Carta, because he said they impinged the divine right of kings. And I mean, yeah, they were impinging divine right of kings, but the divine right of kings, that kings have the right from God to do whatever they want, isn't even biblical. It isn't even right. It isn't just. It's just demonic, frankly. But what God did with the 10 Commandments, and then as he followed through in the law, was he said, I'm setting up in Israel a rule of law where from the every single Israelite from the king on down is responsible for the law. And the law is the ultimate arbiter in our society, not what the king says. Now, in practical, that was hard to enforce because the word of the king was generally, what people did, but it wasn't God's intention in setting this up. And so he starts here and says, God, Yahweh, your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day, and then they were supposed to keep it. So what you had then was you had God resting on the seventh day, but then either not telling people that he did or not making a big deal out of it. And it's just kind of like something God did. Okay, God does a lot of things that we can't do. And then he just lets history roll for 2,500 years until you have the Exodus. And then coming out of the Exodus, God says, let me explain this, what I want for you. I want a day of rest. And he gives them a palpable example in the manna, because if they wanted to work that day, it was useless because they'd go out to get manna and there wouldn't be any there. So he said, I want you to do the work on the 6 days. On the sixth day, there'll be enough for 2 days. And then if you go out to try to work on the seventh day, it's not going to matter because it's not going to be there. It's not going to help you anyway. And he gave them an example that kind of burned into them how the Sabbath worked. And then in the 10 Commandments, he told them, look, here's the pattern. I rested on the seventh day. I want you guys to rest on the seventh day. And I'm going to explain this to you, and I don't want anybody to work. And then he says, it's also because you were under such harsh slavery in Egypt that I gave you the Sabbath day so that you could keep that heart of God in mind, that you don't work yourself or people to death. And then you carry that forward until the time of Christ. And then God says, okay, we're releasing you from the commandments of the law. And the Sabbath, the keeping of the Sabbath day, I've heard people try to argue, well, but the Sabbath day isn't part of the law. The Sabbath day predates the law. No, it doesn't. God's rest on the seventh day predates the law, but that's not the Sabbath. God's Sabbath day commandment is very clearly part of the Mosaic Law. And so it was done away in Christ. Now you and I move forward with the writings of the Apostle Paul and the church epistles, where he says, don't let anybody judge you in the days that you keep, that you want to make holy or have a vacation day or whatever. And the Sabbath was a shadow to point to Christ and the rest that Christ would bring to people. And then just wisdom, walk in wisdom. And wisdom is get enough sleep, take a nap if you need it, take a day of rest, to just allow your body and your mind to relax and to make life fun. Keep life light, keep life fun, because God designed life that it would be fun for us, that it would be a blessing. And so that's what I wanted to share tonight, and I hope that's helpful.